Review between 1791 and 1796. As was the standard, all of her reviews were anonymously signed with initials and have been identified retrospectively by her editors. These reviews contained lengthy quotations and summaries from the books under her scrutiny. For this reason, her suspected contributions to the analytical review allow us to get a sense not only of how she would have likely used words such as democratic and democratical in speech, in writing, beyond her extant corpus, but also what some of the prevailing meanings of these terms were in the 1790s. In a July 1791 review of Memoires de Maréchal Duc de Richelieu, Wollstonecraft used the term democratical in a positive sense as an antonym to the negative term aristocratical. The subject of the memoir was a grandnephew of Cardinal Richelieu, the right-hand man of the absolute monarch Louis XIII. Ironically, the younger Duc de Richelieu was far from a model of clerical virtue, as he was one of the rumored inspirations for the decadent seducer Valmont in Pierre Charlot de Laclos's novel Les Liaisons Dangereuses. Wollstonecraft described the spirit of the Duke's memoirs as democratical, perhaps because he represented the decay of the aristocratical sentiments that had animated the ancien regime of France. In May 1792, Wollstonecraft reviewed Thomas Holcroft's novel Aniseed Ives, which had just been published in London. Here, instead of speaking of aristocratical sentiments of the ancien regime, she reversed the notion to engage the rise of democratical sentiments after the French Revolution. Wollstonecraft did not wholly approve of the narrative, but appreciated that it served as a vehicle to convey what are called democratical sentiments. She goes on to describe a male gardener in the novel, the kind and benevolent love interest of Anna, as exhibiting sentiments of liberality. His foil is the aristocratic seducer, a version of Valmont, who tries to corrupt Anna's principled commitment to a life of genuine love, personal virtue, and independence. What is significant is that Wollstonecraft's association of the term democratical sentiments is with those of the concept of liberality. By the mid-1790s, the word liberality in English denoted admirable social virtues such as generosity, toleration, open-mindedness, and kindness towards others of different ranks, positions, or religions. In her first book, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, Wollstonecraft stated that forbearance and liberality of sentiments are the virtues of maturity, before arguing that children should be taught everything in a positive way, and their own experience can only afterwards teach them how to make distinctions and allowances. In other words, liberality, understood as forbearance, good judgment, and generosity, was one of the key human virtues into which children grew as they matured. In her 1792 review of the anonymous and historical sketch of the French Revolution from its commencement to the year 1792, a work later attributed to the Scottish jurist James Mackintosh, Wollstonecraft continued to employ democratical as an antonym to aristocratical. She also added to her political vocabulary a new variant of the term democracy, democratic. Wollstonecraft rehearsed the author's account of French finance minister Jacques Necker's failure to mend the growing divide between the aristocratical and the democratical parties over the economic collapse of the absolute monarchy. She also quoted the author as describing a recent French account of the revolution as violently democratic. She did not equate this extreme judgment of the source with her own view, but rather reports it as evidence of how the political sentiments of the times take coloring from the prejudices of the human mind. She sets as a future task for some future historian the writing of a more objective history of the French Revolution. This task she undertook herself in 1793 to 1794, when she lived in France during the height of the Reign of Terror. Even as her own life as a British expatriate in an enemy regime was at stake, she composed an historical and moral view of the origins and progress of the French Revolution for Joseph Johnson's publishing house in London. By the time it was published in 1794, her history would openly chastise Robespierre and his wing of the revolutionaries for their extreme anti-monarchism, and worse, the streams of innocent blood shed by their use of the guillotine to enact their radical brand of republicanism. Over the course of her history of the early years of the French Revolution, she consistently distanced her own defense of the legitimacy of constitutionally mandated, rights-based Republican forms of government that represented the popular will through an elected representative legislature from the corrupt, violent, and tyrannical forms of French republicanism that evolved under the leadership of Robespierre and other Jacobins. Wollstonecraft's last known use of a variant of democracy pertained more to revolutions of culture than to formal politics. In her September 1796 review of Major Tench's letters written in France to a friend in London between the month of November 1794 and the month of May 1795, she quoted his use of the term democratic manners to condemn a brutal manner of mingling in society and addressing women as adopted by Republican coxcombs during the reign of Robespierre. Paradoxically, by concurring with Major Tench, Wollstonecraft then turned the notion of democratic manners into a form of approval. By reiterating Major Tench's critique of the brutal and democratic manners of the French Republican coxcombs, she suggested it was better to err on the side of liberality, or generosity, civility, and toleration towards others different than oneself, than to descend into a rude and sexually predatory form of behavior that cast away set decorum in the restraints of civilized life. On Tench's model of democratic manners, Wollstonecraft was the real model of Republican virtue, given the liberality of her principles. Wollstonecraft was finalizing the last pages of her Rights of Woman as the book was going to press. In a letter to the abolitionist William Roscoe, dated the 3rd of January, 1792, she apologized for not writing sooner, as she had been engrossed by writing and printing my vindication of the rights of woman. She told him, I shall give the last sheet to the printer today. The recovered manuscript of a section of chapter 13 of the Rights of Women suggests that Wollstonecraft may have left the composition and revision of the outer framing of the book for last. Now in the Forsheimer collection of Shelley and his circle at the New York Public Library, the manuscript's divergences from the published text suggest that it was a draft of the final chapter of the Rights of Women that the author subsequently corrected. Furthermore, she may have been crafting the introduction and dedicatory preface at the same time as she wrote and revised chapters 12 and 13. These sections of the book have many tropes and arguments in common, centered upon her interconnected concerns with the ethics and politics of slave rebellion, the realization of the equal rights of humanity for all people in a constitutional republic, and the need for a peaceful revolution in female manners to secure the happiness and justice of each and all. Given that the timing of her authorship of the Rights of Women coincides with the news of the Haitian Revolution, it is not surprising that imagery of slave rebellion frames the book. With the surfacing of a manuscript of a section of chapter 13, I would only add that we have further manuscript evidence that Wollstonecraft likely finalized her most explicit defense of rights-based representative constitutional democracy around the same time as she would have heard of the revolution in Saint-Domingue and finished her magnum opus. The most direct line from Wollstonecraft's idea of a rights-based representative republic to the modern liberal democratic tradition is through her own family. Her daughter, Mary Shelley, and son-in-law, Percy Shelley, were devoted Philhellenes who hosted Greek independence leaders and translated for them while they lived in Pisa in 1820 to 21. The Shelleys, alongside their friends Leigh Hunt and Lord Byron, were leading contributors to The Liberal, a literary political magazine published in London and Pisa in 1822 to 23. Its 4 issues were devoted to the exposition of an overlapping set of Republican, democratic, and liberal ideas, inspired by the political cause of popular independence in the south of Europe, especially Spain and Greece. In 1862, James Fitzjames Stephen described the journal as marking the ideological origins of 19th century British liberalism. The Liberal remains an understudied milestone in the history of ideas, for it propelled the association of the capitalized English proper noun liberal with a set of causes that Wollstonecraft and the Shelleys represented. Wollstonecraft had inspired the Shelleys to articulate a new form of democratic republicanism that put equal rights, individual and collective liberation, and national independence at its basis. This far-seeing form of modern republicanism has come to be known worldwide as liberal or constitutional democracy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for Professor Eileen's presentation. Our next speaker is Professor Shoufu. Shoufu is an assistant professor in history at the University of British Columbia. His research teaching centered on Chinese and Inner Asian political thought in global historical context, specializing in areas where history meets philology and philosophy. He works on a wide area of previously unknown, untapped, and understudied sources in different languages: classical Chinese, Korean, Manchu, Mongolian, Persian, Latin, and Greek, to name a few. His current book manuscript, The Chinese Rhetorical Curriculum and Transcultural History of Political Thought, circa 2050 to 1650, provides a new narrative of the history of early modern political thought by examining the rhetoric curriculum that flourished in East Eurasia. The title of Professor Shoufu in his paper is Liu Bei, Plato et al. On Kingship, a microhistory of 17th century globalization and political thought. It's quite an interesting experience reading Professor Shoufu in his paper. It's like a travel novel. The protagonist of the novel is Domenico Fernandez Navarrete, a Spanish Dominican who spent years in Mexico, the Philippines, and China. He actually elucidated Liu Bei's deeds by comparing them with the writings of Plato, Seneca, and Aquinas, as well as various passages in the Bible. Professor Ying devolves into a variety of local global contexts where Castilian, Catholic, and Chinese political thought met each other. Let's welcome Professor Shoufu in to present his paper.
Hi, thank you everyone for giving me this opportunity to do this presentation. My title, thanks to Eileen, is already there. So let's imagine that we are teaching a course, Global Political Thought. We might teach it one day, right? And one day an undergraduate student comes to you. Hi, professor, I have a project. I want to compare two guys. One is Plato, we all know him, it's a Greek philosopher, important. Another one is Liu Bei. Who is this guy? Well, 2nd century, 3rd century CE China. He can be a warlord, an emperor, depending on whether you like him or not. And then what's your intuitive gut reaction to this project? Maybe not that promising, right? My project today is indeed about someone who tried this idea, who fleshed this out, and his name is Domingo Navarrete. Often he was introduced in Spanish Dominicans as a missionary, but today a main argument is to present him as a thinker, theorist, philosopher. He compared Liu Bei, Plato, and many other guys, many other Chinese statesmen, thinkers, or fictional persons with, as mentioned, Plato, Seneca, Cicero, etc. And this is a key book of my focus, Tratados Históricos, Políticos, Éticos y Religiosos de la Monarquía de China. The key point here is that I'm not going to analyze the book as an object, etc. I'm going to zoom in on a tiny passage, just one or two, where the idea of Plato and various other figures being compared to Liu Bei pops up. And my argument is that this instantiates a pioneering approach to global political thought. And here I mean a serious commitment to go beyond various ideological kind of stereotypes that antagonizes different traditions, and also a deeper historical background of global integration, global empire, and global traveling. Ultimately, I hope the theoretical takeaway point is that Navarrete is important for two reasons. One is that he contributed to an important discussion embedded in Thomism, more familiar to us as King's two bodies. That is, the sovereign is not only the soul of her own natural body, but also the soul of the kingdom, the state. Using Liu Bei, the very bizarre, awkward Chinese figure, Navarrete offers a proviso. I will call it Navarretian proviso. That is, how about the pain? If the king is really the soul of two bodies, how about the pain afflicting the king? And Navarrete was arguing, well, this pain must also be twofold. And this is what we shall follow. And the important part of argument today is also that as such, Navarrete is not only contributing to an European sea of body politique, but also offering new insights to the global readership of Liu Bei's story. as we shall going on. Liu Bei's story is not only known in China, known in the Sinitic area like Vietnam, Korea, Japan, but also translated into Manchu, Persian, and in this stage introduced to the broader European audience. And as such, Navarrete is one of the many thinkers using Liu Bei in the succession crisis, as we shall discuss, to re-theorize constitution and succession. So let's start. First of all, a little bit about the person, Domingo Navarrete. So that is UBC, where I taught. And here is Spain, where Navarrete received his education, joined the Dominican order. And a very important part of his experience is he traveled to Mexico first, spent several years there, analyzing political problems, thinking about theological issues, and then takes a ship heading to Manila, the Philippines. And then he taught there again for several years, learning several Chinese regional languages, Tagalog, as well as teaching Dominican theology. And then he headed for China, especially in regions here, that is the coastal region of Fujian and the local intellectual centers of Jinhua. So an important dimension of his intellectual world is not only the global interaction, as we have already introduced a little bit, as we shall see later, also important is the particular politics in Mexico, in Manila, in Jinhua, and other regions in China. My paper will devote a considerable part not only reading the published intellectual works of his, but also a relatively large records, quite formulaic travel passages, archival documents. It'll be interesting to see how this guy expressed himself through these very formulaic forms, like we file visa applications. As we shall see, sickness, pain is important there as a key theme. And another key theme is what is deserved to him as a bishop, as a missionary, as a traveler. And for him, this is an important part of the global church empire. Bishops, clergy, they enjoyed certain rights which should not be disturbed. And that, in the end, in the most formulaic expressions that punctuate all documents is such, it is a concern of justice, a key theme to which we shall go. We might not have time for that today, and let's go to the passage. As such, I would like to introduce to you a little bit about the plot. So the story is 221. Liu Bei, the emperor, was about to die. So in theory, by constitution, in a certain sense, he should pass his throne to his heir proper, his son. But on his deathbed, he said something to his counselor. You are the worthy person. You have the best judgment. If my son is worthy assisting, then assist him, help him. If otherwise, you can take over. It is a well-known story. You can read it from different perspectives. For instance, Spanish politics here. For instance, Carlos II, if you're familiar with that, is in his childhood, and Don Juan is an important kind of figure. And Navarrete was involved in politics as such. In Chinese context, it is in Sinitic context, it's very familiar. And people debate whether kind of Liu Bei is sincere or whether there's kind of Machiavellian project going on. And as we shall, the goal today is to unpack Navarrete's take on that. Before delving into that, interestingly, we can brief a little bit of the history of books. Actually, I'm 99% sure about that. So from which book specifically Navarrete draw his information? So textually, this is from a particular print of coastal China. It is a kind of popular, kind of best-selling kind of chronicle, telling people what has been going on. And this book was brought to Madrid around 620-ish. So Navarrete has access to some version of this book when he was in coastal China, but when he was rewriting this book in Madrid. So this is probably the exact copy that he utilized, at least based on textual kind of comparison, it is. Overall, Navarrete offered relatively literal translation. So not very kind of crazy summary, but relatively literal translation. We can do the textual analysis. I would like to highlight certain places that despite the literal nature of translation, Navarrete really emphasized. So there's a key term is over there, you can see. The Chinese meaning 亲兄弟 means take care of these brothers. Take care of, Liu Bei was telling his heir, really take care of your brothers, meaning take care of Liu Bei, his own son. Nevertheless, they offered very different reading. So he misread it in a certain sense as ministers, subjects, as brothers. So he is romanticizing the monarch, which is Liu Bei, saying something, consider your subject as if they are your brothers. So you can have a sense of the kind of Christian Catholic connotation behind and how he radically reinterpret a certain line in Chinese. What is even more interesting is not how he retells the narrative, but how he adds certain comments onto that. So the purple part is where he takes a pause. He was saying, well, we have read an episode of interest, but before moving on, let's pray. So this is a particular kind of Dominican prayer. He inserted that. He, as such, is kind of turning a kind of reading practice into a prayer, celebrating God in a certain sense. And then he moves on. This is a central passage, the coda of climates for today. Now, this comparison between Liu Bei and other figures can be divided into three parts, structurally very beautiful. First, comparing Liu Bei in a certain sense, a pagan king with a Catholic king, that is Saint Louis of France. And then he briefly alludes to the idea of divine kingship of Jesus Christ, and then narrow down, zoom in on the pagan king Liu Bei and these pagan philosophers. And here we have Plato and Seneca. And in the end, he offers a synthesis. Based on the previous comparison, we can bring in St. Thomas Aquinas. Even though he seems to be citing primary sources in a very kind of accurate way, but that is misleading. So he is actually drawing his kind of materials from the secondary material Justus Lipsius, which it's a very kind of popular print. It happens to be the case that in both these cases, nevertheless, citing Plato, citing Seneca are both wrong. So the Plato citation is very wrong as a passage that Lipsius invented, and the Seneca passage is even more wrong. It comes from a famous, complicated textual authorship, a text called Apollokintosis. It is about satire. It's saying the emperor, after that, they can become deities. But the satire is saying, hi, they are really becoming bumpkins. Utilizing satire as such, entirely kind of, Lipsius entirely turned into a language of sarcasm, into a bizarre language, saying that via justice, via piety, a Roman emperor can really become deity. So Nevertheless actually kind of did not really look deep into that and take into that and bridge these kind of citations together to make the following key point, to offer a new interpretation of Thomas Aquinas that he cited. That is about the king's two selves and the king being subject to two kind of pains. The pain naturally is relatively easy to understand. Liu Bei is dying, right? He must be very painful here and there. But nevertheless, point is that there is a kind of pain political or pain politique that concerns injustice, afflicting the subjects of the realm. And it is this kind of a capacity to feel not only the natural pain, but also the political pain that makes Liu Bei, the Chinese emperor, important and makes him has a place in the dialogue about body politics and in dialogue with other thinkers. I would like to emphasize, as I mentioned, Nevertheless was not the only thinker who made interesting observations based on Liu Bei's story. As mentioned, the Liu Bei story, after all, is about succession and it's about constitution. Constitution in the sense, in what situations established norms, practices, rules of primogeniture can be suspended. And slightly earlier, prior to Domingo Navarrete, the Chosong kind of minister, Cho Chan-hang was offering a relatively very different interpretation. He was saying what Liu Bei was doing is attacking monarchy from its ground, saying that monarchy is not justified. What Liu Bei was saying is that in order to pass the throne, it should always be important to pass it to the worthy person. So as such, we can take Liu Bei as a nexus of a much larger network, connecting different kind of 16th century, 17th century readers embedded in their own court politics. And Chao Changhua was also facing a crisis of succession. If we have time, we can go into that. As such, okay, running out of time, summaries, thank you. So methodologically, I'm providing a microhistory, not a person, not a book, but rather of a passage. This allows us to go deep into the intertextual connections between passages on one hand, and on the other hand, if we have time, we can do more about the physical features of these pages. As such, my key point is to think Castilian, Catholic, Chinese, and Joseon political thought, they are even richer and more diverse than we previously thought. And then relatedly, I have been presenting a kind of analysis of different layers of globality. Global empire, global traveler, localities connected globally, and problematics of global scale, and finally, a globally oriented philosophy as such. Yeah, we can stop here. Thank you so much for
Thank you, Professor Shoufu, for his passionate presentation. And let's welcome our discussant, Professor James Hankins. Professor James Hankins is a full professor in history department at Harvard University. He's a globally renowned intellectual historian specializing in the Italian Renaissance. He's the founder and general editor of ITT Renaissance Library, published by Harvard University Press, and the associate editor of the Catalogus Translationum et Commentarium. Professor Hankins has been a Fulbright Scholar, a member of Society of Fellows in Humanities at Columbia University, Fellow and Visiting Professor La Villa Tate, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the American Academy in Berlin, a member of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. So just to save our time, I will cut it short. And there's like a full long list of publication of Professor Hankins. And in order to save time, I will skip it. But let's welcome Professor James Hankins to give his comments on the panelist papers. More than that, I think. Yeah, take your time.
I'm going to stay seated here because usually I either lose my glasses or my phone. And this morning I lost both my glasses and my phone, which is a sign that I'm getting older. But I think I'll just stay here and maybe easier to segue into a discussion after my remarks. I hope there'll be a little time left over for that. I just wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me to attend this conference and read these three very rich papers. I thought what I could usefully do in my brief time as a commentator is to raise a few questions, but also suggest some avenues for future research, especially addressing the question, how can we make these papers even more global than they already are? So I'll start with Sergio's paper, a very stimulating paper I never really considered before, the geopolitical function of these terms like Las Indias and America. So thank you for getting my thought process started on that. So my suggestions for further exploration would be, I understand that people who do global Spanish Empire already think that they are already global, but you could be even more global by taking in maybe some way the other European countries use these terms, the Indies and America, and the names of the continents. And we should maybe distinguish between different types of, I hesitate to use the word discourses, but there's the discourse of international diplomacy, which begins with the Treaty of Tordesillas and does not use the term Indies or continents, or they talk about the ocean. It tends to be, well, I don't know how I haven't investigated anything beyond the Treaty of Tordesillas, but I read through it this morning. They don't have either of these terms in it. And then, of course, later on, the British and the Dutch both use the term West Indies, East Indies. They have the East Indies companies, but both countries have East Indies countries. This goes back to the 17th and 18th century. So one of my questions would be whether Indies, the term Indies, is primarily used in trading context, whereas continents tend to be more associated with colonial context. But that's obviously wrong in the case of the global Spanish Empire, but it might be true elsewhere. And if you bring the history down to modern times, I think, for example, I looked up the Monroe Doctrine, which turns out to be a speech by James Monroe, the President of the United States. And he refers to continents, right? There's the Europeans and the Americans. He's saying Americans should control the other America, the Europeans should stay out. So that's a kind of geopolitical claim. But West Indies is also used today as the name for Caribbean countries, right? As if I understand correctly, the Indies were one time considered by the Spanish considered to be North, South America and everything on the Pacific Rim, basically. But nowadays there is the Federation of West Indies, which is Caribbean countries, and there's the University of the West Indies in Barbados. So they think of that as their cultural space. So I think that would be one way to make that more global, is to investigate how these terms are used outside the Spanish global empire. Passing on to Professor Hunt's paper, it seems to be this is very fascinating, very solid, interesting talk about the evolution of Wollstonecraft political language, projected to some degree against the history of the period. I find this fascinating to see how already in the early 19th century, this language is being used at the same time that the second phase of European global empires is being organized, the spread of republicanism in Latin America, the Greek Revolution, which is attempt to chip away at the Ottoman Empire, and then later on the conversion of the British, begins the British Empire, Second British Empire, and then Africa and Asia and so forth. So this language is coming into existence around the same time as the European empires are expanding in a different way. So Europe is shifting from a traditional emphasis on spreading civilization, spreading Christianity, spreading private property in the case of the British, to this new international language of liberal values, republican government, equal rights of the whole people, regardless of race, class, gender, which or they would say sex probably in this period, which was with us for a long time. So the issue that attracts me here is how political alliances and rivalries are rarely questions of pure power politics, as the realists would want us to believe, but they're always cultural as well. We say, talk about soft power today, and it changes over time. So in the early Cold War, America was trying to make common cause with sympathetic nations on the basis of a shared commitment to freedom and democracy and capitalism and free markets, and opposition to authoritarian communist regimes. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a shift to the language of universal human rights. There's a very good book by Sam Moynihan on this, which I'm sure many of you know. So the international community, as it's called, was trying to spread its values that way. And then more recently, just actually in the last decade, the US State Department, this has gone into high gear since the Biden presidency started, I've been promoting a different set of ideas through the UN Human Rights Commission, new rights, new norms, new global struggle, which, so this includes a critique of racial injustice, systemic racism, promotion of equity in the new sense of equality of outcomes, dismantling systems of oppression. The Secretary of State Blinken instructed the embassies to fly the BLM flag, in the summer of 1920, and we're now promoting sort of gender ideology around the world, which wasn't too successful in Afghanistan. But so the U.S. Secretary of Defense has ordered the Defense Department to broaden the number of countries willing to support and defend human rights of LGBTQI plus persons, making, trying to spread the gender ideology around the world, using the U.S. Agency for International Development. So there is a tendency for these things to change. We need to historicize the way that power deploys culture. And I think that the paper of Professor Hall is a very good start on that. All right. So, and one way you could do this is to look at how Western European American cultural imperialism is seen by those on the receiving end. Because I don't think we have enough, we don't pay enough attention to how the people who were trying to convince of our superior values receive that. There's a very, but I think it was a study like Bernard Lewis's study of the Muslim discovery of Europe, where he talks about how the Muslims thought about Western Europe. This is a pretty modern period, but I think it would be very interesting to study how, since we're globalists, right, we're being global, we should study how the people who don't necessarily agree with our values, and maybe hostile to our values in the West, take that in. So ideological colonialism, I guess. So this brings me to Shoufu Yu's very brilliant paper. I love this paper, by the way, on Domingo Fernandez Navarrete. I have to say you're a polymath to match the 17th century polymaths. That was a great century of polymathy, so you're the right person to be doing this. And how Navarrete uses Plato's Anagoginas, the Bible, to make sense of the career of Yu Bei, who's the Chinese emperor. And this does look a lot like, at least the passage you put in your paper, A Mirror of Princes. And I think that that's a very interesting context to put it in. Especially this idea that the sovereign must feel the pain of his political body, that there is a kind of organic quality to political rule. And that, of course, is in the Western tradition. It's very prominent in medieval law, the idea of the body politic and what that implies. But it's given a new life in Renaissance by humanist political thinkers who may have been familiar to Navarrete from his youth, because he is trained in Valladolid, right? So Valladolid, where they have a humanist arts training, and he teaches arts around in Mexico and in China. So he must have encountered this. This idea of the state as an organic institution, organic body, where the health of the head affects the health of the body. There's a kind of circulation of virtue throughout the body politic. And if the king is not just, then the body dies. Right? This is the fundamental conception. And the chief author here, by the way, is a guy named Guido Capelli, who's at the University of Naples, and he writes in both Spanish and Italian. He's the one who's been elaborating this idea of your organic state, but it goes right into the Mirror of Princes tradition in the 16th century, which reaches its height in the 16th century, and also makes use of what I call the historical prudential method, where you're not using abstract analysis of ideas, but you're using more historical examples. That death speech of Yu Bei was quite impressive, because I've read many things like it in the Mirror of Princes literature. They're constantly citing people like Cyrus I and the Cyropaedia of Xenophon, who make these speeches on their deathbed, or at least try to arrange for the succession. And it's very much a humanist principle that